And there too is a word of comfort here. Naomi felt the deep grief of emptiness, and the Lord met her in that by giving provision, protection, and care through relationship with others.
And that God meeting her, that brings us to our third point today, which is experiencing God's goodness.
So the theme of experiencing God's goodness comes to fruition in the third chapter that we're looking at today. So we heard that Naomi is longing for a home for Ruth. So chapter 3 begins with her proposing a plan. She tells Ruth to put on her best clothes and perfume and to go to Boaz. So let's take a deeper look at what happens in the text. So this is chapter 3, starting at verse 5, and Ruth is responding to Naomi. "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." So this is a bit of a strange interaction, to be sure. An unconventional exchange happens between Ruth and Boaz. And we hear that Ruth's initiation is both out of the norm and risky, right? She goes to a place in the middle of the night, initiates this interaction with Boaz. But we hear in her words to him that she has a deep understanding of a truth. She understands that how God's goodness is often made real is through other people. When Ruth identifies herself in this conversation she has with Boaz, she tells him to spread the corner of your garment over me. In this imagery, different than our day and age, is essentially a proposal of marriage. She is asking Boaz to marry her, and she does so by using language that harks back to a previous interaction that the two of them had. When Boaz first meets Ruth in chapter 2, he blesses her, and he says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." The Hebrew word for wings that Boaz uses in that blessing in chapter 2 is actually the same Hebrew word that Ruth uses for garment in chapter 3. And in this, Ruth is using the language that Boaz spoke and invites Boaz to make good on God's blessing. And she shows and tells him that God's blessing and goodness isn't outside of him, but actually can come through him.
And one thing we see too is that Ruth, she's not only the one experiencing the goodness of God, but that Boaz is experiencing the goodness of God as well. Because as Boaz responds to her, he says this, he says, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier." A little bit more Hebrew here to dive into, but that Hebrew word for kindness that Boaz uses is the word hesed, which maybe that's a familiar word. It's one of the words for love in the Hebrew language. And what it means is a steadfast love, a covenantal love. And this is actually often the word of love that's used and attributed to God. And so here we hear it used by Boaz to speak of Ruth in a way that shows that he as well is being blessed by her and experiencing God's goodness through her.
And the goodness of God doesn't end here. As Ruth is leaving, Boaz has her take her shawl and he fills it with 6 measures of barley. And so in chapter 3, verse 17, when she returns to Naomi, she tells her all about the interaction that just went down and the things that Boaz said to her. And she says to Naomi, "Boaz gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Well, if you remember from chapter 1, when Naomi arrived in Bethlehem, she cries out saying, "The Lord sent me out full, but has brought me back empty." But no longer is she empty. God's goodness in Naomi's life is being manifested through her relationships, through Boaz and Ruth. And just as we see with Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, experiencing God's goodness often happens through others, and it isn't just one single relationship. God's goodness through Boaz impacts both Ruth and Naomi. God's goodness through Ruth affects Naomi and Boaz, and so on and so forth. God's goodness is embodied in a web of relationships. And just as we see that in the story, we are invited to be like the characters, both the presence of God's goodness in our relationships and to receive God's goodness from others.
I think that's exactly it. And so Ruth shows us that God works through other people, and that's often happens in the midst of a community because all of the characters meet their needs through that web of relationships, as Lauren talked about. But this movement actually reminded me of a piece that I read a couple weeks ago that referenced something called the weakening of the middle circle in American society. This piece, it drew on a book that was written by a guy named Mark Dunkelman called The Vanishing Neighbor. But he talks about how he kind of divides up our community into three different layers. We have the inner circle, which is like our family and close friends, people that we see day in, day out every week. And we have the outer circle, and that's maybe people that we share an identity with or an affiliation with. This could be the people of our nation. This could be sports, fan bases, all the Seahawks fans. Or it could be all Seattleites. And then we have the middle circle. In the middle circle, these are people who we're familiar with, but maybe we don't see them every single day. These are people who are friends of ours, but they don't know all of the inner workings of our lives. And Dunkelman, his main argument is that the biggest shift in American society in recent years has been the erosion of that middle circle in our lives. We have invested maybe more in our inner circles in recent years, especially since COVID. And then also the 24-hour news cycle and social media has made it so that we maybe feel more connected to the outer circle, but it's that middle circle. The people that we casually know and encounter in less frequent spaces, that keeps thinning out. And the whole premise of this piece was that was one of the reasons why people are feeling more lonely and people are feeling more disconnected in this country. And so what's the antidote to this? The antidote is to show up to places and that build that middle circle. And the piece that I was reading in Dunkelman, he actually points to the local church as being a wonderful place where you can invest in that middle circle. And when I read this a couple weeks ago, I was thinking, okay, that makes a lot of sense, and the middle circle is all good. But I feel like something clicked in me this week as we were studying the book of Ruth of why that is the case and why that's so important. It's because often God works through those relationships that we have, and God can work through communities like the church. Eric Henderson, the lead pastor at Green Lake, often says the church is God's plan A for changing our lives and changing the world. And so we get to see this all the time, the middle circle and the ways that that God works through that. Lauren and I, we have the privilege of course, kind of seeing more behind the scenes of what happens at the church. And so we see the deacon teams and prayer teams and care ministries that are often caring for people in times of needs. But we also see a lot of the less frequent ways that volunteers are caring for each other, or stories when small groups come around someone who needs something in a time. God works through our relationships, and often God works through that middle circle, often in surprising ways, just as we see in the story of Ruth.
And one of the unique things about the book of Ruth is that while God is clearly present throughout the whole story, this actually isn't a book recording God's divine, direct action or word. We have a lot of books like this in scriptures, particularly the prophets, and while we in our own lives can often long for that direct voice or call from God in our lives, more often our stories look like that of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. That God is working instead through our web of relationships, through our community, his goodness embodied in our relationships. So as we consider the scripts that the story of Ruth offers us when it comes to healthy relationships, there is both a challenge and a comfort in this word. When it comes to God's goodness, Ruth challenges Boaz to recognize the ways that God has called him to embody God's goodness. Boaz is the guardian redeemer for Ruth's family. There's a level of responsibility and call there. And he asks the Lord for the Lord's blessing for them. And it turns out that God says, this blessing doesn't exist outside of you. In fact, I am going to bless them through you. He is an active participant in that blessing. So like Boaz, how is God wanting to use you to bring the goodness of God to your relationships? And there too is a word of comfort here. Naomi felt the deep grief of emptiness, And the Lord met her in that by giving provision, protection, and care through relationship with others. The book of Ruth began with Naomi seeking to go out on her own. She asked her daughter-in-laws to return to their own home so she could be alone. Yet through the hesed, the steadfast love of Ruth, Naomi experiences God's goodness in her life. So then how, like Naomi, can we be open to receiving the goodness of God from others?